It's all about who you know in medical marketing. When I joined MM+M in April of 2022, my colleague Steve Madden and then EIC Larry Dobrow gave me a quick rundown of the leaders I had to know as I settled into covering the industry. There were top 20 pharma executives I had seen in mainstream news coverage, as well as dozens of ad agency leaders I knew nothing about, but would have to soon learn everything about. Among that crop of executives was Wendy Lund, an honoree from our Pinnacle Awards and Women of Distinction program. I first met Wendy in September of 2022 when she left her position as CEO of Agency 100 honoree GCI Health to serve as Chief Client Officer for Health and Wellness at WPP. We stayed in touch over the years through interviews for the publication and meetups at various events and conferences. I've always found Wendy to have a clear, pointed view of the industry, with an eye for emerging trends and the need to adjust in real time to meet client expectations. Over brunch at South by Southwest, I told Wendy that we had to get her on the podcast sooner than later. Lo and behold, that day has come. As part of an in-person interview with reporter Bella Jakowski, Wendy dives into a recent HarrisX Allison Worldwide study on how GLP-1s are reshaping attitudes towards weight loss and care. The report was released late last month, and chief among its numerous findings was the observation that GLP-1s have moved firmly into the mainstream, though public conversation around them remains split between medical breakthrough and moral judgment. As Wendy told Bella, quote, "Culture is shaping health, but health is also shaping culture." And for our trend segment, I'm joined by Madden and Bella for a conversation about all that went down during the FDA's recent 2-day advisory panel focused on peptides.
I'm excited to be joined today by Wendy Lund, who's in studio with us in New York here. She's the global CEO of Allison Worldwide. And I had the privilege of speaking with her a couple weeks ago about a study that Allison conducted with HarrisX about GLP-1 use, specifically between the US and the UK, which is just a super, super interesting study. And I feel like shed a lot of light on things that we didn't previously understand. So let's start there. I think it's safe to say that GLP-1s are no longer merely a pharmaceutical category, but they're sort of reshaping culture, identity, and healthcare access, which is what we talked about in our last conversation. Can you just tell me a little bit about what that requires from the people marketing them?
I mean, what I find so fascinating about this, having worked in this space my entire career, and it's been a long career, is that there's never been another time like this. It's really unprecedented. And I think it comes down to a few different things. I mean, one is the actual cultural revolution, but also the medical revolution, that 1 in 2 people suffer from a chronic disease, and the fact and the impact that this can have on people with chronic disease is, we haven't even really begun to see the result of that yet. So as we get into the next 5 years, I think it's going to be critically important and exciting to kind of see what the impact is. But the marketing piece is equally interesting. And I think what really makes it quite profound is that, in traditional marketing in healthcare, as you guys well know here, it goes it's a very linear approach, like one thing to another. You see an ad, you go talk to the doctor, you ask for something, you usually get it. Here, there's so many different entry points to be able to actually get access to these drugs. And this is a good thing. This is enabling patients and consumers to get the drugs when and how and where it's most accessible to them. So I think our world in healthcare will never be the same. I find that incredibly exciting because it also uses all different types of tools in the arsenal, right? It's not just around advertising, but around influencer, which we can talk a little bit about, and what we saw at Cannes, communications, digital obviously is big, et cetera. So
absolutely,
whole new world.
And I do want to talk about Cannes and influencer marketing, because that's an area I'm definitely interested in. But you mentioned you've worked in sort of the obesity market for a number of years, and you sort of saw and have recognized just how revolutionary GLP-1s are in that space. Was there a particular moment or an event where you were like, wow, this is going to sort of take the industry by storm?
I think it was early in the GLP-1 entry point where we really started. I mean, first it was like a cultural phenomenon where we saw it on every night show and every TV show, and, certain words were used over and over again, whether they were right or wrong. And now I think there's just been such a more normalization of it because the companies have really doubled down on making sure that the drugs are getting into the right hands and that people are benefiting from them. I think it was that inflection point between when it was like a cultural phenomenon or a pop culture phenomenon to when the drugs were actually being seen to work and taken seriously, and physicians were getting on board and patients were asking for the right things. Because, our studies showed that physicians are still, and HCPs are still a very, very important part of this, that patients and consumers are looking to HCPs for the prescription and making sure that they're really getting from the right people so that they feel that comfort level with the drug.
And I was encouraged to see that trust remains, highly with HCPs when it comes to those things in the data. Let's talk a little bit about CAN. Let's talk about GLP-1s, sort of how you saw that conversation shape up at CAN this year, which was obviously, it was dominated by AI, but I think it also must have just been dominated by GLP-1s.
So I was really excited and, really fortunate to spend most of my time talking about GLP-1s. I also spent time talking about women's health, which might be another podcast. There were 3 areas I focused in specifically around GLP-1s. The first was actually about women and really working with the World Women Foundation and other amazing people. I had someone from Novo Nordisk on my panel. I had someone from Reddit on my panel. So they told a really good story about the conversation that's happening online. But I think what was most important is that, we're living now in this new era of enablement, right? Where patients and consumers can go wherever they need to go to get what they need to get. And it's going to be more versus less as we go forward. For women, there's still a significant stigma that exists. If you're 1 pound overweight, there's a problem. If you don't lose via diet and exercise, there's a problem. Things like this may be seen as shortcuts. So we need to move away from that. So I think where we really are going to benefit from seeing more and more education on platforms like Reddit, influencers, and where women are starting to see the normalized conversation around this, they're going to feel much more comfortable removing stigma. We've seen that in every area or every condition that has been stigmatized in the area of health and women. And I am assuming that this is going to happen here too. So that was one area. The second one was probably one of the most inspirational things I've ever done in my career, which was at Creator House and working with a creator to tell her story. I was also there with Harris X, who actually was our partner here. And her story was incredible. She was 140 pounds overweight. She went to the doctor. She had had 2 strokes and 2 heart attacks at that point. She was not even 50. Her doctor said to her, "You are going to die if you do not do something." It was a stark discussion. And she went on GLP-1s. She lost all that weight. And it was just amazing to hear her story, not just from the physical piece, not just even from the health piece, but the emotional piece. When you see pictures of her wearing like a Spider-Man costume with her 2 grandchildren, and she looks amazing, but you can see she's amazing from her face, her smiles, telling her story. We're going to be doing a lot more with her. And the key fact that came out in the survey is that when people see influencers and creators telling their story, which we're seeing more and more and more of, it normalizes the story for them and they see role models. Third piece was exciting, working with GoodRx and Novo Nordisk on stage with brand innovators. Mm-hmm. We talked about the new ways to market and all the ways in to get GLP-1s, and they had some really great insights that were shared with that group.
Absolutely. I mean, it sounds like there were all sorts of just rich discussions. And I'm glad that you brought up this conversation around holistic health. And I know we talked about this previously too, like the conversation sort of moving beyond weight loss for cosmetic reasons to, improving health outcomes generally. There was a stat that I wanted to pull out that more than 7 in 10 users said someone had commented, GLP-1 users had said someone commented on a change in their weight or appearance. And I'm curious what you sort of think about how marketers, are they thinking about changing that messaging from, or maybe not changing, but like expanding the messaging from purely weight loss to like overall holistic health benefits? And how can they sort of be doing that better?
So I think that's a wonderful opportunity. And, as I've talked about my whole career in the space, it's not just about one disease or one thing. It's about everything that impacts that. For marketers, obviously they need to see the positive outcome of that, in terms of putting dollars behind that kind of marketing. But I ultimately think the positive will come back to support them, because if you think about, let's just talk about mobility. Okay. An easy one. People getting around, people moving when they're obese, it's so much harder. They have all these comorbidities. So, if you're more mobile and if you're able to walk 3 miles because you've lost weight and you've reduced your numbers, you feel really good about yourself, right? Yeah. So why would you not want to encourage this? And that gets into adjacencies for all these other companies to be talking about all the things you're enabled to do through using a GLP-1. So I think we're very much in moving the phase 1 to phase 2 period right now as we see more drugs coming on the market over the next few years. And then there are all these adjacencies in the world around food, around clothing, around sneakers, whatever it might be, where the world is going to never be the way it was 5 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk a little bit about influencers again, or creators. How can personal sort of testimony around use of GLP-1s be powerful, but also sort of, I think about like flattening experiences. And we talked about this a bit too, like medical experiences are so complicated and so individualized in a sense. So how do you sort of see the role of influencers in sort of spreading the good word, but also not making people feel like there's like overpromise basically?
I think, having worked with influencers sort of since the very beginning, and I worked with them more specifically in the area of diabetes, which is very much tied to this, sharing that common experience amongst themselves and then people hearing those common experiences is what I think is probably most impactful. Understanding, what you can eat, what you can't eat, what happens, what doesn't happen, the emotional impact of what it means to be obese or not obese. And I think when people hear those shared experiences, it creates such a larger comfort level for them. They're more likely to keep going because we want to make sure people adhere, right? And that's an issue. We want to make sure people are asking and people are acting on these things.
Absolutely. I mentioned at the top of the episode that it's really interesting seeing the comparison between the US and the UK. And the UK, while not the size of the US, has a sizable GLP-1 market. But I think the data also pointed to, there are differences, of course, in the two countries and how advertising works, how the healthcare system works, totally different business model, of course. What do you think healthcare marketers can sort of draw out of that? Like how, certainly I think it's fair to say that there's not a one size fits all approach to messaging because of those differences.
So the difference in the numbers is 1 in 4 in the US have used a GLP-1, 1 in 3 in UK have used a GLP-1. So I don't know that they're that far apart, given the fact that GLP-1s came on the market in the US first. Like just yesterday, GLP-1, Wegovy tablet was approved, right? In Europe.
Yeah.
Or I believe UK. And it's been approved here for a number of months. So I think part of the discrepancy in the number may be in a catch-up period of like how long, but your point, very importantly, around direct-to-consumer marketing is very well taken. Because if you're not learning about it from a DTC ad, how are you learning about it? And I think where the key learnings are coming from is cultural relevancy, peer-to-peer influence. When you go out to dinner and there's 10 people, usually 8 people of them are on a GLP-1, then there's a lot of conversation. So the conversations are happening very differently now, both in the US and Europe and in the UK. And, we also have to think about access. US, we're much more dependent on private pay. UK, they're much more dependent on government pay. Sure. So all of these things have an impact on the access and whether people are using them or not. I believe the UK is going to catch up right up to the US and the US is just going to keep going.
Yeah. And sort of speaking to your background and working in women's health, I see a lot about like empowerment or sort of adjacent words to empowerment when it comes to GLP-1s and women, especially taking control of their health, whether it be for weight loss or, general health improvements. I'm curious sort of what you think about sort of whether that sort of those semantics, those words like empowerment runs the risk of making women feel like they're personally responsible for overcoming like structural barriers to care.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to like lob off the EM and make it just around power.
Yeah.
I think empowerment was a word that we used a lot in the 1990s and the early 2000s when women really weren't empowered to make certain health decisions. I think ultimately now we're at a point where innovation is moving. I think the big issue is that there's probably not as much of addressing some of the larger areas that women are still suffering from. We won't go down this road, but like endometriosis is a good example, right? Fertility is another example. So we still need a lot more innovation in this space. I think that GLP-1s, offer an opportunity for women to talk. And this is what women, when it comes to their health, they're really good at, which is sharing with friends, ripping the Band-Aid off. I've noticed even in my friend group that people are much more likely now to talk about the use of GLP-1s and their personal use than it was a year ago.
Yeah.
So I think everything's starting to like normalize this between what we see on television, what we hear about, conversations we have with each other, things like this, influencers, creators. it's all becoming like normal part of our cultural fabric of health versus like this taboo thing that we shouldn't talk about.
And you perfectly predicted the nature of my next question, which is, you were describing in our last conversation how we're at a unique sort of moment here where health is shaping culture and culture is shaping health. And I'm curious what you think are some sort of examples of how GLP-1 use might be shaping consumer behavior, like beyond the doctor's office.
So I was doing some research this week, and the number one thing that, this is like my ChatGPT search and my Gemini search,
Sure.
right? Both consistent. The number one thing that people care about in the world, far and away, is their health. Their health is priceless to them. And I think that has spread very far and wide. And I think what it has done, it has pushed people to actually push harder for things that matter to their health. Now, do we have a road to go in terms of cancers and heart disease and all these killers that still, come after us? Definitely. But I think also, the thing about GLP-1s that's so interesting is because they're so accessible in so many different ways and then inaccessible in others, it helps with all of these things. So, I think it's going to be very interesting. And I'm curious, what MM+M thinks about this, because you guys are at the center of like marketing and drugs. What happens in the next 5 years when all these other drugs come on the market? That is going to be, to me, sort of an eye-opening moment for us to see how these other marketers go into this, to look at things like you're saying, holistically, maybe certain disease areas that they want to focus on. It's all going to be like definitely a case study in, how you build a category.
So funny. I was actually just going to ask you to project or forecast what I was going to say 1 year from now, but maybe 5 years from now is a better timeline. What do you think medical marketers will realize they misunderstood about the GLP-1 era? Let's say 5 years from now.
I think you've hit on a bunch of the things that I think they'll realize. I think that they'll realize that it's really important to be very clear around how you message and how you talk about these things and how they bring the data and the science forward. But I also think keeping this in the center of a cultural revolution, and it may not be a revolution by then, but making sure this cultural relevancy and cultural fluency still exists, because we're just on the precipice of sort of what happens next. And that's what I'm so excited to see in the next 5 years, is like how cultural really begins to define health. And as you said, how health defines culture. We're just at the beginning of that. And it's just exciting for me to see consumers really taking control of their health now. Yeah. It's not a wellness fad. It's like, I am going to really understand my health. I'm going to do things about my health, or I'm not going to do things about my health. And obviously a lot of this comes off of COVID.
Yeah.
And what we learned during COVID, and the fact that people were knee deep in Dr. Google during COVID.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy to just think about how far perceptions of GLP-1s have come from when the Kardashians were the only ones using them, or at least publicly, to now. It's just like a 180, total 180. So it'll be interesting to watch. We'll certainly be watching it here. But Wendy, this has been a great conversation. Thank you for coming in and joining us. And yeah, I'm sure we'll catch up with you again soon.
Thank you. It's been great. Appreciate it.
All right. We already got the GLP-1 conversation out of the way for the podcast. Now we're jumping into one of our other favorite topics, which is peptides. Bella, before we hop into this head first, give us, our audience, a little bit of a briefer on why we're talking about peptides. What was in the news recently?
Yeah. So there was a panel that convened to talk about the increasingly popular peptide market, often discussed as a gray or black market because it comes from illegitimate sources, often that are research grade. They're described as research grade, but people are, of course, using them still. So there was a panel of advisors who came together to discuss sort of what the federal government should do, and ultimately decided to make it a little bit easier, or I guess suppose lay the groundwork for compounding pharmacies to sort of manufacture a short list of peptides. And it's been a pretty, polarizing decision. And interestingly, a lot of the people on the panel were just recently put on the panel, and 8 of them, I think it was 15, actually sell peptides themselves. So I don't know, that kind of there could potentially be a conflict of interest there.
Struck you as a little bit of a conflict of interest. We'll get into all of that too. It's one of those things that, even in the lead up to it, you had RFK Jr. going out there and saying like, oh yeah, this is something that like he personally takes peptides. This is something that he's been wanting to see the FDA loosen. And so it's not really a surprise that that's what came to pass. But the reaction to your point has been very polarized, very charged. Matt, I want to bring you in here because you've obviously covered the space pretty extensively. You went to the Enhanced Games, which wasn't peptide exclusive, but it was definitely in the peptide universe. What was your reaction to seeing the conversations that came out of the panel and then ultimately the decision, which did kind of grease the wheels, if you will, for future peptide loosening?
Well, I was just sort of slack-jawed at I don't think there's any doubt about whether there's a conflict of interest or not. These people who make their money selling peptides say ignore the science, like, don't worry about the science. Even if it says the science is thin and we don't know enough to understand the full safety of these things and the implications for overuse or misuse or even use. But you should totally take them because I sell them. And I wouldn't sell you, trust me, I wouldn't sell you anything that's not good for you. Or, the worst case is it's not good for you. Best case is it just doesn't do anything. And that's one of the things that you need to take into account. Like some of the stuff could be pure snake oil. And just because Joe Rogan says he takes the Wolverine stack and he's totally jacked because of it, doesn't mean it actually works.
I can tell you that I've grown pretty tired just from a semantics perspective of hearing the word stack. I've seen that a lot of pitches that we've gotten. I've seen a lot of conversations about peptides. People like, oh, this is my stack and whatever. It's become one of those buzzwords that just drives me up a wall for reasons I can't fully explain. But Matt, I want to ask you too, because there is this angle to it where it's like, okay, you had RFK Jr. out there very forcefully advocating, and to Bella's point, putting people on the panel that ultimately voted the way that he did. I mean, I guess you look at this and it's like a W for the Maha movement, but I kind of look at it like at what cost? Like there is this kind of public consternation about, well, you just kind of stacked the deck and then got the result you wanted. Like, what do you make of it from RFK's perspective?
I'm sort of dumbstruck by how this aligns with Maha, because a significant portion of Maha is about like getting rid of processed foods. Like, don't put that stuff in your body. We don't fully understand what it does. And yet here's another thing that we may or may not fully understand what it does. And yet, sure, go ahead, inject it. You can inject yourself in the butt, maybe your upper arm, abdominal fat. If you don't have any fat because you're taking GLP-1s, just into your abdomen. So there's a duality here, a contradiction, if not an outright, contradictory statement about this. And it's like, I just don't understand it. It's magical thinking is what it is. It's like, there's no rigor to it. It's just like, this is what I feel like doing, so that's what I'm going to do. And maybe that's what Maha really is about, like personal initiative and personal responsibility for what you put into your body. But if that's the case, then don't get upset that Roundup is not banned. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to your point there too, I think that there is definitely Maha as a movement is a large political tent, and it's obviously something that Trump wanted to tap into during the 24 election and has rode that with RFK's endorsement, then giving him HHS. Like it makes sense in that sort of way, but there is a libertarian bend to it. And Bella, I'd be curious about that from your perspective, where it's like, we talk with marketers and brands all the time. They're like, oh, how do we get in touch with people that want to be more active in their healthcare journey and want to have more agency in terms of the decisions that they make? It's like, well, this is also part of it too, where people are willing to take these, in some cases, calculated risks, in some cases, outright risks, that I probably wouldn't take with my own body. And it's like, okay, so how do you message on that when people look at this and it's like, oh, I'm getting sold peptides online? What do you do with that information?
Yeah, I was in researching for this discussion, I was looking at TikTok and I saw a video with a ton of views and engagement. And it was this person breaking down like the 3 routes you can take to buy peptides online, or access peptides rather. And it was ranked by they're like the safest option, but and the one that requires you to know the least is like go to a med spa or a doctor and have them prescribed and go through that whole thing. That's obviously the most expensive, the most like burdensome. And then it went down to buying them from things like literally the TikTok shop. And the person said, but the hazard there is like, you really need to know your stuff. You need to be able to like do your research, understand what you're putting in your body. Like there's a lot more burden on you as the consumer then. And that just struck me as so surprising because like, how would you know? Like, how would you know? Even if you're like, what are you reading? What are you researching? And like, and the suggestions for research were like, look on Reddit and Discord and like private, server. And it's like, yeah, there's just such, and I mean, I think that does go to like the individuality and like the health liberty of the MAHA movement, right? Like being able to make that decision yourself. But it's so like sort of reminiscent of like the let me do my research before I get the vaccines argument also. It's just weird because it's an action, not like a not taking an action.
And it's going to social media too, which obviously we've had Reddit in and around our coverage. We've had the story that Lola wrote about the Reddit survey on women's health. And that's one thing when it's like, oh, I want to understand more about, say, like endometriosis symptoms. That's one thing as opposed to like, and Matt and I'd be curious about this too, because you said that you've started getting served more peptides ads as you've written about it, as you've gone to the enhanced games and stuff. There are things on there. I'm like, I don't know what these different compounds and chemicals are. And it's like, I certainly don't think that I can go to a Reddit channel and they're going to explain all that to me, but maybe I'm wrong.
I mean, you can look, gyms are filled with amateur chemists and pharmacists. They just are. And, you can get your hands on pretty much anything you want or precursors to pretty much anything that you want. The question just is like, I did my research. And it's like, okay, you did your research. What sources did you use? Were they scientific? Were they, was there rigor behind the research? Or is this just some guy, some dude that's online and you came across this stuff and it reinforces what you already believed? That's the real danger here, is that we know, we all had some training in college about journalism. And one of the things you learn is that people gravitate toward sources that reinforce what they already believe. And it's the rare individual who could just say, like, I sought out contradictory opinions. I sought out stuff that went against what I wanted to believe and made a decision. That's a very rare person, which strikes me as really odd, because you just like, it's your body. You just want to shoot this stuff into you. It's like, in a former life, I covered cycling, and these guys would, go to high altitude camps in the winter and train and have really high hematocrit levels. They'd take the blood out, hand it to some guy who put it in a cooler, said, I'm going to freeze this for you. I'll give it back to you in July. Hands him a bag of dope in July when he's tired and says, okay, I'm going to inject this back into you now. Ready? That's just crazy to me.
Side question from what we've been talking about. Did you ever do that for your magazine coverage? I feel like that would have been a great segment where it's like, I'm going to get my own blood re-injected back into me.
I'll tell you, after going to the enhanced games and talking to some of the athletes and seeing this one guy in particular, Cody Miller, seeing what the programs he was on did for him, I'm like,
Brain gets to thinking.
And it could make a great story. Outside Magazine did a great story in the early part of, in the early aughts, where a guy went, an anonymous writer went and found a doctor who would prescribe EPO for him. And then all of a sudden this guy started tearing up the local bike racing. So, because people take that stuff because it works. It does. It does as billed. There's the question is, we know for a fact that EPO, a variant of, or one brand of which is made by Amgen, works. It increases red blood cell count because it was designed to help chemotherapy patients when they became anemic. And it was designed to help them increase their, boost their red blood cell volume. And it works like hell. And that has a really salutary effect on an endurance athlete. This stuff works. We don't know if the peptides work. And that's the point. It's like, yeah, you want to be free to inject this stuff. First of all, you want to be free to sell it and have the government approve it or turn a blind eye to it so that you won't get sued when it turns out that this stuff causes tumors.
And that's like, And that's, I guess, if I can pop back in here, is like, not that hypocrisy matters for anything, because we do in certain circumstances live in such a post-truth, post any sort of accountability world. But I mean, a lot of the people that I've been hearing talk about like, oh, we should have this availability and access to peptides, were the same people that were like, well, I don't know what's in the COVID vaccine. I don't know what mRNA technology is. I don't know. And we're willing to feign ignorance and go to court and lose their jobs and scream at people wearing masks during the 3 years that we had that public health emergency and a once in a lifetime pandemic. And now are lecturing me that, oh, well, yeah, you gotta take this stack. That's all this. I'm like, yeah. I
have a thought.
Give it to me.
A hypothesis, rather. I'm wondering if, as peptides, if this recommendation, if the FDA fully signs off on compounding peptides, if as they become more sort of institutionalized and mainstream and people think a little bit more about the profit motives, because I'm thinking, like, as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about, like, a lot of the vaccine skepticism came from like, oh, well, of course, Moderna, of course, Pfizer wants you to take this vaccine. They're profiting from it, even if you're not paying it for it directly. Like, it's all big. And that's such, that's so much the sort of skepticism and frankly hate that pharma gets generally is just like the bottom line. People are skeptical. But I'm wondering if, like, as this becomes a bigger business and it feels a little bit like less grassroots and more as like a sanctioned, maybe not ever FDA approved, but thing, like if people will sort of lose that fire in them to like get behind the cause of peptides.
That's a really interesting point, Bella, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because another part of what we're going to see. So, the thing about peptides was July's entertainment. In September, the entertainment's going to be around psychedelics, because that's a big part of RFK Jr.'s agenda, is to get psychedelics approved for all kinds of things, but treatment for. And there's some actual science to back this up, that psychedelics could work as treatment for depression and PTSD. What happens with, the thing with peptides is it could be like kind of mom and pop shops, although Hims bought a compounder recently to make peptides, not exactly a mom and pop operation, but there are pharmaceutical companies that have bought psychedelic companies. So, Lilly just did it last week. Yeah. Is the allure, of these things, because they're coming from mom and pop operations, that makes them safe. And there's going to be all this skepticism about, taking, a derivative of magic mushrooms just because a big pharma company makes it. What difference does it make?
It is fascinating too, man. Like, Madden let me, the Cameron Crowe book, which I'm going to get back to. I'm sorry it's taking me so long.
Have you read it?
I've been going through some other stuff. I'm in the final pages. But one thing that I think is interesting is he makes the point a couple of times in the book about certain artists or bands or even movements that get corrupted by the money, that lose the pizzazz because suddenly money gets involved. And that certainly applies to like punk and different genres like that. And I do think that there is something to that, where it's like, I remember when marijuana was first getting legalized, and it was Colorado and Oregon were the first two legalized. And now, like, there's even the backlash. There's supposedly going to be a ballot measure in Massachusetts about recriminalizing marijuana, because again, you have all the money that floods in, it becomes corporatized, all that sort of stuff. The idea that same thing could happen to peptides, where, yeah, at this point, it's just kind of like mom and pop. It's very low grade. But once you start seeing that consolidation and that more corporatized structure to it, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that. We're already starting to see in the psychedelic space. They know where the money is going to be. They know where the interest is going to be. It's just then up to how are the consumers going to respond to those market forces.
But you see that in culture and everything in culture. It's like, hey, my coffee used to be really good. And it was like, just this one guy roasting beans that he hand selected from farmers who picked everything by hand. And it was really good. And then he sold it to a bigger chain, and I don't buy it anymore. Is the coffee still as good, or is it just the story, the provenance? I know it's true with handmade bicycles. It's true with wine and craft beer and everything else. It's like people love the origin story almost more than they love the product, which is the result. So it'll be interesting to track that.
Definitely. I want to give Bella the final word here just because you've done a little bit of coverage in terms of like the Wild West aspect of the compounding pharmacies. And to Madden's point, they have obviously had renewed focus from Hims buying a compounding pharmacy. Noom bought one, within the last year or so. Like, what do you think this decision means in terms of where I would assume that this is like, oh, we got a little bit more momentum at our back, but like they're certainly not out of the woods yet either.
Yeah, I've done a lot of reporting on compounding pharmacies, and most recently I had a provider describe it to me as the Wild West, especially as it relates to adverse events reporting. And so that's obviously one aspect of the broader compounding picture, which I feel like has become more mainstream and people have more awareness of in the last couple of years. But there's going to be a lot of questions to answer. And unfortunately, there's not the framework, the infrastructure doesn't necessarily exist. So like, say you take a drug from J&J, your throat closes up. Your doctor or the manufacturer reports to the FDA, like, this person's throat closed up. There's no requirement on compounded drugs for, anyone to do it. There's no like labeling instructions, anything like that. And so I think we're sort of already on the precipice of some additional requirements there. So maybe it's coming at a good time. But yeah, compounding, and people have been saying this for a long time, is like when GLP-1s hit compounding pharmacies, it just it was such a boom because there weren't limits, or there wasn't governance in place to control the growth and expansion, and also keep people safe as they were using compounded drugs. And compounded drugs are important. It's important people have access to them.
I think it's important to say, I'm not an apologist for RFK, but part of his stated logic for pursuing this is that if they're taken off of a banned schedule, right? They'll have manufacturing over. The FDA will have manufacturing oversight and can make sure that the compounds or the things that go into the compounded drugs are pure. But that's actually not even true. That's part of what he's saying.
Yeah, it's the state boards of pharmacies that have control over compounding pharmacies, and I mean, when I was doing my reporting, it's like sometimes there's like 2 or 3 state pharmacy inspectors for an entire state.
Yeah, no, he's talking about the manufacturing facility that makes the product, not the FDA is not going to have oversight over the states. It's the raw materials that go into it.
Yeah, the active ingredients.
Yeah,
there's a lot to figure out.
Well, luckily we have so many more weeks and months to figure out where the state of peptides are going to go. But I appreciate you both being able to weigh in, both from, an advertising perspective, a regulatory perspective, plenty more that we're going to be able to dig into over the coming weeks and months. And even next week, we have a great interview. Who we got? We got our friend Matt Zachary, the cancer patient advocate, came in studio recently for an interview with Bellis. That's one you won't want to miss. And I will actually be out on vacation, so I won't be here for our next trend segment. So you'll get to hear from the rest of the team on whatever they want to talk about. And when I'm out there in Colorado, I'll be listening to it on bated breath. So thank you all for tuning in. This has been the MM+M podcast. I'm Jack O'Brien, executive editor. Hope you had a great time. Take care, and we will see you soon.
The MM+M podcast is produced by Jack O'Brien, Lesha Bushak, Steve Madden, Jamison Fleming, Bella Chakowski, Bill Fitzpatrick, and Gordon Failer, with additional production by Lola Offenbach and Julia Ramada. Listen, follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts.